Kathleen, going to talk more about trade because the US and Japan have begun a high-level economic dialogue in Washington. Japan's economy minister says he had a frank exchange about trade with Robert Lighthizer, although Tokyo has indicated it prefers multilateral deals such as the TPP, which the Trump administration has, of course, abandoned as part of one of his campaign promises. Let's bring in Thomas Schieffer, who's a former US ambassador to Japan. He joins us now from Fort Worth in Texas. Ambassador, what are the likelihood that we're going to get some success out of this round of talks, given that the TPP is expected to still be a bit of a sore point?
Heidi, I think it's going to be a difficult negotiation because basically we have two countries going in opposite directions. The Japanese, who were longtime bilateral traders, are now multilateral traders, and the United States has reversed its position and now is seeking more bilateral trade agreements. So I think this is going to be a difficult set of negotiations. The Japanese were very upset with the United States pulling out of the TPP, and I think that the indication and the efforts that they made to keep the 11 together were very strong. I think Australia and Japan really should get the credit for that. And their hope is that the United States will one day rejoin the talks and be a part of the TPP.
Do you think there's a likelihood that the door is still ajar, that the US might rejoin the TPP, given that it's pretty much consensus that that would be one of the most powerful and comprehensive ways of countering Beijing?
Well, and I think that's what we urged the Japanese to come to the table for that very reason. And it made a lot of sense. And both the Bush and Obama administrations were big advocates of Japan joining. And when they did join, they made great efforts to made great sacrifices with their agriculture sector to make the agreement. And then when we pulled out, it really was a jarring event to them. But I think there is, over time, there will be an opportunity to rejoin the negotiations, and I hope the United States will do that, frankly. But I don't know how soon that will come. But the TPP makes so much sense, not only from an economic standpoint, but from a security standpoint. And I think that it can be a huge part of the bringing Asia into China into the world community and by playing by the same rules that everybody else does. And I think that's what the TPP would have done, and I think it would do. And I think that's why the Japanese are so interested in keeping it alive and in the multilateral negotiations that would be needed to do that.
I want to follow up on that because I can see very clearly that the Japanese have this as a front and center concern. The TPP was about way more than trade. I was at a conference last spring with some Japanese, one former defense minister, talking about the concern over China wanting hegemony over Asia. But from what you hear and from what you know, is there any chance that that aspect has gotten any more important with Donald Trump than it has been?
Well, a couple of months ago, the president did make some indications that it might be in the United States' interest to explore the TPP again. But that seems to have gone by the way in the last few weeks or so, and the emphasis is on these bilateral negotiations. And I think that the president would want to choose the bilateral option right now, but I think in the back of his mind, hopefully re-entering the TPP negotiations would be there too. So I think we have to see how this plays out and how far it goes, but there's no question in my mind that the Japanese are much more interested in a multilateral decision in trade than in a bilateral treaty with us.
You were involved in negotiating the U.S.-Australia free trade agreement years ago, worked on U.S. and Japan trade. So as someone who's been at the table, what's most important about getting a deal? And specifically, what do you think is going to change the balance between potentially, in a positive way, between Lighthizer and Motegi?
Well, I don't know specifically what would turn the tide. Mr. Lighthizer, Ambassador Lighthizer, has a very strong views on trade, but I think agriculture has been the issue that has been the most difficult for all nations to negotiate, and the Japanese made some very deep decisions that were difficult to make. And I think that having made them, they don't want to lose the opportunity to make them a benefit in the way of trade. But I think that also, when you talk about trade deficits and the effect that they have on economies, I think you have to take into account foreign direct investment. And I know that the Japanese are going to point that out in these trades. And when you talk about closing that gap, you can close it through foreign direct investment. And the Japanese have made huge investments in the United States. About 75% of the automobiles the Japanese automobiles that are sold in America are made in America. And I think that you have to take things like that into account when you talk about trade and the effect it has on each other's economies.
Yeah, Ambassador Schieffer, no doubt one of the conversations that will come up over, today and tomorrow potentially will be this idea of the trade war between Washington and Beijing really having a massive impact on the entire Asia supply chain, in particular the likes of Japan and Korea, right? But, you look at the back and forth when it comes to the rhetoric between Washington and Beijing. We hear about a rift in, between the likes of Stephen Mnuchin and Donald Trump there. How much of it is a bit of sort of good cop, bad cop, and negotiating tactic when you see that both sides are digging their heels in and each round of tariffs is being retaliated against? What's your sense of what's actually going on there?
I think that we have a very serious situation with regard to China and the trade war that is emerging out of it. And I think the Chinese are not anxious to look as if they're doing the bidding of the United States. And when you get into a situation like that where it's just tit for tat, where each side responds to the other, it just is a downward cycle. And it's not one that produces good results for either country. And hopefully the rhetoric can cool a bit and both sides can reflect on what they're doing, because the U.S.-China relationship has a deep impact on not only the Asian economy, but the whole global economy. And I don't see where a trade war would be good for anybody. And I think the Japanese share that view. I think both sides really share that view, but here we are. We've got to figure out some way to get out of painting ourselves into corners that we can't get out of.
Ambassador, I really appreciate you taking the time to speak with us. Ambassador Tom Schieffer, who's a former U.S. ambassador to Japan and also here in Australia as well.